Amazon Prime members now get free grocery delivery with the minimum order. You'll get your groceries with 2-hour delivery. So in that time, you can use photo filters to imagine what you would look like with bangs. But don't do it. Just imagine. Meditate. Notice your body. Feel your breath. Am I doing this right? Get lost in a Wikipedia spiral. How do flowers propagate? Whatever it is you're doing with your time, your shopper will be carefully picking out your favorite groceries while providing contactless delivery to your door. Free 2-hour grocery delivery, now with Prime.
Welcome to the 315th episode of the Reading and Writing Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Rutherford. Stay tuned for my interview with author Jennifer Steil, author of the new novel Exile Music. And stay tuned for after the interview when I have a short excerpt from the audiobook of Exile Music. And stay tuned for the interview. If you're new to audiobooks, they're the perfect way to get more books into your busy life. Listen to audiobooks during your commute, while doing chores, walking the dog, or just relaxing at home. All you need is a smartphone and the free Libro.fm app. If you already love audiobooks and don't know what to listen to next, check out recommendations and curated lists from people who know audiobooks best, your local bookseller. Reading and Writing Podcast special offer, get 2 audiobooks for the price of 1 with your first month of membership with code RWPodcast. That's code RWPodcast for 2 audiobooks for the price of 1 for your first month of membership at Libro.fm. Well, welcome back to the Reading and Writing Podcast. My guest today is Jennifer Steil, author of the new novel Exile Music. Jennifer, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Great. Well, if someone listening hasn't heard about your novel Exile Music yet, how would you describe the novel?
Well, the novel tells the story of a family of Austrian Jewish musicians who are living in Vienna in the 1930s. The father is a viola player with the Vienna Philharmonic. The mother's an opera singer. And their daughter is around 10 at around the time of the Anschluss. And the family, around 1938, by 1938, there were only 3 countries in the world still granting visas to Jewish refugees who were fleeing Nazi-occupied Europe. So my family finds visas to Bolivia. So most of the book takes place in Bolivia, where they find refuge. So it's a story of how they rebuild their lives all over again in the middle of the Andes.
And do you remember excuse me? Do you remember the original idea that led you to write Exile Music?
I do. It's pretty vivid, actually. I lived in Bolivia for 4 years. My husband was working for the EU as head of the EU delegation at the time. So we were living in La Paz, which is at around 12,000 feet or 4,000 meters, depending on where you are, how you measure things. And life at that altitude can be fairly challenging, even if you haven't just lost your family, your career, your money, everything. And so I was imagining when I lived there, sorry, let me start over again. Yeah. My husband came home from work one evening and said, I've just had the most incredibly interesting conversation with the Austrian consul, who said that during the war, there were between 10 and 20 Jewish refugees here, most of whom were artists and musicians and had lost their professional lives and their families and careers and money, et cetera. And so there was a fairly large refugee community there during the war, which neither of us had actually known. I've read a lot about Jewish communities elsewhere in South America, but not in Bolivia and definitely not in La Paz. So I very soon afterwards met a man whose parents were among these refugees, and he introduced me to other people who had fled the Nazis to come to Bolivia. One of these, well, I could tell you about another one if you want. But yeah, sure. I'm sure there's a man who came from Austria when he was only 8 years old, and grew up in La Paz and learned English from his landlord's children. And he told me some funny stories about climbing up from the third class cabins on the ship to the first and second class cabins so that he could watch films. He was a huge film buff, and he ended up owning a bunch of cinemas in La Paz. And it was really interesting to interview him because he's now in his 80s and has never been back to Austria. And when I asked him if he had ever gone back or thought about it, he said that never, ever would he consider going back to Austria after what it did to his family. And those emotions are still so strong for him that he was in tears. So I wanted to it seemed to me that a lot of the world didn't know the stories of these Jewish refugees and what they faced in La Paz. There's some unusual challenges that come along with living at altitude, and also when you're coming from a city and suddenly you're in the middle of the Andes Mountains. It's a pretty big cultural adjustment, aside from the language and everything else. So I got the idea, first from my husband, but then from the refugees and descendants of refugees who I met while I was living in La Paz.
And so if someone listening is not familiar with La Paz, what would that city have been like in the late 1930s compared to Austria?
Well, it was one of the memoirs I read said, this wasn't a city. This was little more than a village. It was a city, but not a city in the way that Vienna was a city. It's every road in La Paz is either straight up or straight down. You're surrounded by the Andes on every side. You're kind of the city spills down a bowl in the middle of the mountains. And at the time, there were probably only around 200,000 people living there, 250,000. When you're coming from a major urban center like Vienna, where there was opera and theater and orchestras and the world in which my characters lived, and you go to La Paz, where there were none of these things. It was much less developed, much. It was just, it was much
smaller.
It was a lot smaller.
And so was there a specific reason that these refugees selected Bolivia and La Paz as a choice to move to at that time? I mean, obviously they were under a lot of duress. I mean, it's not like it was a choice, but.
Right. And by 1938, only 3 countries in the world were still accepting Jews who were fleeing Nazi-occupied Europe. So Bolivia was one of those 3 countries, and the other 2 were the Dominican Republic and Japan-occupied Shanghai. So after 1938, it would have been impossible to get a visa to anywhere else.
And so you talked about the person that you interviewed who ended up owning and running movie theaters and cinemas in La Paz. I'm curious, in terms of the research that you did, did this community, did a lot of them stay there after the war? Did they assimilate? What was kind of your discovery in terms of your research, in terms of that community and how they adapted? I mean, did they leave after the war? Did they move to the U.S. or other places? What was your discovery there?
Yes, the majority of them did leave after the war. I think a lot of people found it quite difficult to adjust to life there. So those who could left for the United States or to the newly formed Israel once that after 1948. Mm-hmm. And others went to other places in South America that were slightly bigger cities or had more to offer in the way of careers and jobs. So it's actually quite a tiny community that's left in La Paz. So while it was a much bigger community during the war, but there are still some of those people there.
And did they kind of assimilate? I mean, have they stayed in their community, or I'm curious about
Well, that's a really interesting question because that depends who you ask.
that.
Um, because some people, and I read a lot of first person accounts in addition to speaking with people. Some people published their accounts really just to have a record of their experience and to share with their family. Others, published them with actual publishing houses. But some people said, oh, people just stuck to the German refugees, the German speaking refugees kept to themselves and they didn't bother to learn the language. And then people like Wilhelm, who's now Guillermo, um, he's the 80-year-old man I interviewed.
Right.
He's completely assimilated, utterly. And when I asked him, I used a lot of different pieces of his story in my book because my main character Orly learned Spanish from her landlady's children, just like Guillermo learned Spanish, and he apparently learned Spanish right away. He said he was completely welcomed. He went to schools with Bolivian children, and he just, and I said, was there any anti-Semitism? And he says, no, never. I never experienced anti-Semitism. But then I've read many other accounts that said very clearly that there was anti-Semitism. Again, a lot of these questions, I'm sure both are correct. Maybe Guillermo didn't experience anti-Semitism and other people did, which is probably the case. So I'm losing track of where I started here.
No, that's fine. So in the book, you write about, in addition to what we've been discussing in terms of this community that fled Europe and moved to La Paz, you also write about bisexuality and the love story between your character Orly and her best friend. And this is obviously, as we've been discussing, this is a historical novel set in the late 1930s. And I'm curious, how did you approach that character, and did you do any research in terms of how should I say this? In terms of just the people's acceptance or discussion or acknowledgement of bisexual relationships at that time?
I did. I did a lot of research on that. I did a lot of reading around that, around kind of what was then pretty much an underground gay scene in Germany and Austria around that time. And I think when we look at the past, we often think that maybe people weren't having as much sex back then, or or we think of them as more proper or something. But people were very much having sex back then, and gay people were having sex with other gay people. And there's quite an interesting series of books actually called The Scorpion. And that book actually is mentioned in Exile Music. But that book talks a lot about it. The main character is a lesbian. Unfortunately, a lot of the lesbians in the literature of the time come to bad ends, probably because they weren't allowed to allow lesbians to have happy endings. But there were a lot of characters who end up alcoholics or suicidal, things like that. But there's some quite passionate and explicit love scenes in these books, and I was very interested in those. And I think I didn't set out with the intent of making Orly any particular sexuality. It just happened organically as I was writing her character, that I felt like her bond with her best friend was more than mere friendship, even though they were quite young when she left Austria. And the people she's most drawn to in La Paz are other girls. And I think she isn't quite sure what this is or what to do about it until she reads The Scorpion and realizes that there are other girls like her and women like her. And she eventually talks to a friend about this, and her friend says, oh yeah, my aunt was like that. And realizes that, she isn't the only person who's ever felt this way about girls. And I think while she isn't for the most part interested in boys, there is, I don't want to give too much away, but there is one boy in the book who she does come to love very much, and that is a genuine love relationship. I didn't want it. I think because he's such a lovely character, and because she wouldn't have been able to, certainly not in Bolivia, or probably anywhere at that time, but Bolivia these days is a pretty difficult place to be gay. So back then would have been a million times harder, and she certainly couldn't have married a woman.
Right.
So, but I did a lot of research about that and a lot of thinking about how she, what thoughts she would have had about her own sexuality and who she would have talked to about it and things like that. And yeah.
And so, what was your path to publication for Exile Music? How long did it take you to write it, and then what was the process for finding a publisher or agent?
Well, I've had my agent since my first book, so and I adore her, and she's wonderful. So I had an agent already, but with fiction, generally, as you know, I'm sure you do have to write the whole book before you can sell it, unless you're a celebrity. So this book took me a very long time to write, partly because I did 4 or 5 years of research before I could really write a lot of the scenes. And even when I was doing final rewrites, I was still researching. I was researching this book right into the day it went to the printer. I mean, I could probably research it for the rest of my natural life because there's just so much material and there's so many different aspects to this book. I mean, there was an Austrian holiday that I wanted to include in the book. It was something my husband had told me about in one of the latest drafts, and I ended up finding an expert who'd written a PhD thesis on this subject at the very last minute. So anyway, after I'd had I don't know if it was a first draft or one of my first drafts, I sent it to my agent. So generally what I do is when I feel like I've taken it as far as I can by myself, I send it to my agent, and I usually go through a few rounds of edits with her. Mm-hmm. And when she feels that it's good enough, she will then send it out to editors. She doesn't like to send anything out that isn't brilliant. So,
right.
But at the same time, I knew that I would be doing a lot more work with an editor. It was quite a complicated book, and I really love and appreciate the entire editing process, because the book is so much better with each draft. And I think I also need time in between drafts in order to get new perspective on it and see what's missing, see what doesn't ring quite right. So I had a wonderful editor at Viking who helped me rework each draft, and it got so much better with each successive draft, just because I had the right people asking me questions and challenging me to get it to the next level. I mean, it's not a process for the impatient, and I'm a pretty impatient person, so it's a strange career for me to have chosen. But I do know, how much it just takes time. The whole thing takes time. Yeah.
And so, in terms of the actual writing process and the different drafts, did you outline, or do you outline when you're writing fiction, or do you write more organically?
I don't outline. I have tried outlining a few times with disastrous consequences. Usually what happens is, if I've written an outline for something, I then completely lose interest in writing it. For me, all my discovery happens in the actual writing. So often when I sit down to write a scene, I have no idea how it's going to go. And it's only after I start writing that I see, oh, this is how it's going. I don't want to sound too much like I'm channeling spirits from another realm, but sometimes it does feel like that, especially when I'm writing dialogue. It's almost like I'm recording something, or that, I don't know. I actually cannot write unless I'm writing. I can't think forward about the plot unless I'm actually working on it, which might be why I need so many drafts. But I also tend to write in in kind of little pieces that can then be shuffled around like a deck of cards and put in different order. And so I don't always write the scenes in the order in which they end up in the book. I write the scene that's most interesting to me at the moment. I'm writing a novel at the moment as part of a PhD program, and that's an interesting experience because my supervisor actually writes novels the same way I do. And so I'm writing with more conscious intent than I usually do. That conscious intent is still part of my process, but it usually comes in the editing phase and not in the first draft.
And so where are you getting a PhD program from, or a PhD from?
The University of Birmingham in the UK. I'm talking to you at the moment from London, although we don't actually live here at the moment. We live in Tashkent, Uzbekistan, and we're just evacuated. But the University of Birmingham has a distance learning PhD program.
And do you think that novel that you're working on for your PhD will be something that you submit for publication at some point?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I am having so much fun writing this book. It's completely unlike anything I've ever done, and I love writing it, and I love the whole process of the PhD program. I just feel it feels like the greatest luxury in the world to write a book with a PhD supervisor when I'm used to writing books alone in the dark.
And so I guess what's that process like? I mean, obviously you were referring earlier to multiple drafts that your agent and then working with an editor. So what has this experience been like for you?
Well, when we started out, he said to me, I think the first thing he said to me after our first meeting was he asked me to write 5 different openings for the novel that we'd been discussing. To get into a PhD program, you have to come up with a whole proposal. So you have to have at least a vague idea of what you're going to write. So I had an idea for a book, but it was pretty formless. And he said, well, I want you to write 5 openings, 5 possible entry points for this book. So I did that. And that was really exciting. And I ended up using pieces of all of them, although none of them are the current entry point. And after that, I kind of just built on those original pieces, and various characters developed or were introduced, and then I decided to throw them out. And after I generated kind of a mass of material that wasn't necessarily in any sort of chronological order, I started from the beginning again, and we talked through the structure. But I meet him once a month, and he reads what I'm working on, tells me how I feel about it. We talk about what I'm reading. I've been reading a ton of South American literature because this is another South American book, entirely South American. So that's been really exciting too, discovering all these authors I hadn't read before. And
are you reading those in English or Spanish?
I'm reading them in English, unfortunately. I speak Spanish, but my Spanish is not at the level at which I can easily read giant novels. So I wish it were.
Yeah.
But you can't do everything.
So you've also had a memoir published previously, The Woman Who Fell from the Sky, an American journalist in Yemen. How different is it for you writing fiction versus memoir?
I personally find fiction much harder. Writing memoir, I was a journalist for many years, and writing memoir feels like long-form journalism. I was writing a story that I already knew. I knew the plot. I knew the characters. I knew what happened. So all I had to do was come up with the structure and actually write the scenes. Whereas with fiction, I start with nothing. That's the hard part. There's nothing worse than a white page. Whereas with a memoir, you at least have the material handy. And my memoir is just about 1 year of my life. It's the year that I spent running this newspaper in Yemen. So I had a fairly succinct piece of time to work with. And that writing that book wasn't nearly as difficult as writing the next book, which was a novel, or writing this one. This one took forever. But
And so given your writing both memoir and fiction, what advice would you have for aspiring writers who may be listening and are working on their own stories or novels?
well, what I often tell young writers is that they should go somewhere that makes them profoundly uncomfortable and live there for a while and see how it changes their perspective on the world. I just found that while I was a writer and not a terrible writer before I moved to Yemen, I felt like I didn't have anything really to say. And it was only from living in Yemen for 4 years and then later in South America and now in Central Asia that I've gotten perspective not only on my own life, but on the US and privilege and all sorts of other things that come up. You don't, I think, realize how entangled you are with your own culture when you never leave it. And I think sometimes a lot of people who are very good writers simply have nothing to say. And often if you travel or switch your environment so that you're challenged, it will cause realizations to happen in your brain that give you something to write about, if that makes any sense.
Sure. So what books, fiction or nonfiction, have you read recently that you would recommend?
Okay, so I loved Elaine Castillo's book, America is Not the Heart. It's wonderful and brilliant and so beautifully written and so sexy and just fantastic. I love that one. I loved Prayers for the Stolen by Jennifer Clement. What else have I loved? Blood of the Dawn by Claudia Salazar Jimenez. A lot of the stories of Clarice Lispector. What else have I read recently? I really enjoyed reading Death in the Andes by Mario Vargas Llosa. I mean, that's not a new novel, but one I really, really enjoyed and got a lot out of. So,
great.
Do you want more? Or is that
No, that's great. So, where can people find you online if they're interested in learning more about you and your novel?
Well, my website address is jennifersteil.net. So that's Jennifer, and then my surname is Steil.net. I'm also on Twitter, so at JFSteil7, so JFSTEIL7. I'm on Facebook, and you can just look for my name. And Exile Music is, you can go to the Viking, look for it online anywhere.
Great. Well, again, we've been speaking with Jennifer Steil, author of the new novel, Exile Music. So go grab a copy of the novel now. And Jennifer, thanks for doing this interview.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Great. Now stay tuned for a short excerpt from the novel Exile Music, written by Jennifer Steil, narrated by Hilary Huber, and published by Penguin Audio. Available wherever audiobooks are sold.
When I think of Austria, I remember what a child remembers. Details as vivid as the bright shards of a dream. The coffee-warmed air of the kitchen, the rough fabric of my father's suits against my cheek, the chalk dust of my classroom tickling my nose, the ice-crusted snow in the Eswetenvisa meadow that cut my eyebrow open when I fell off the toboggan halfway down the slope. My Annalisa. My parents' voices in the kitchen as I hovered still and silent by the door, secretly listening. It was important then, to listen. I remember the tang of my mother's apricot jam spread over a thick layer of butter on crusty bread. The fungal stink of my older brother's dirty sports clothing on the bathroom floor. The earthy scent of the square olive oil soap that was always slipping into the sink. I remember a plum tree in our small communal courtyard that dropped its sour sweet fruit onto our terrace. They were a dark, dusty purple, more oval than the green ones we would eat in Bolivia. In Vienna, Annalisa's mother collected the dropped fruits and used them to make tortas. I remember my mother's voice in our parlor, starting off low and gathering the energy to soar. I remember the scent of rosin on horsehair, the vibrations of my father's viola, how I could feel the notes on my skin even after he stopped playing and I was in bed, listening only to the silence. I remember the inky smell of my schoolbooks as I cracked their spines, the sound of Frau Fessler's ruler smashing into my desk when she caught me with a book on my lap during math class, the way the fruit gummies from Vices got stuck in my back teeth, so I had to pick them out with my fingernails. I remember the damp heat of Annalisa's hand as she folded it with mine for the last time. I remember our neighbors' long coats decorated with flocks of badges saying only, "Ja." The swastikas on every armband and flag, pinned to every lapel, painted on our sidewalks. They even fell from the sky, flurries of paper spiders dropping onto our heads. I remember the newspapers my parents hid from me under sofa cushions. I remember lying awake, twisting the satiny border of my blanket in my fingers until my mother came and curled around me. I remember her breath on my neck, the ice of her fingers on my spine, stroking my skin until I drifted into dreams. The bland, quotidian details, the textures of ordinary days, seared themselves most permanently. Except for Annalisa. Annalisa, who was neither bland nor ordinary. Annalisa, who was more a part of me than not. Our mothers had birthed us in the same building a week apart, and from then on, there were no divisions between us. The 4 syllables of her name were my first song.